All right, we're going to get started on the biology of Barton Springs presentation. Since we don't have a broadcast facilities here, if you want to move in closer to be sure you can hear. I'm pretty loud and some would say obnoxious, but I don't know about Laurie. But we'll
yeah, because it'll be really hard to see some of the stuff that I have, particularly these really small insects over here.
Yeah. So come forward, be close.
It won't hurt you.
Don't be
promise.
shy. So thank you so much for coming out for the Barton Springs University sessions. I'm Bill Bunch. I'm Executive Director of Save Our Springs. And I'm just here very briefly to introduce our speaker, Laurie Dries. Dr. Laurie Dries. She earned her Ph.D. In biology at University of Texas in Austin here. And she's been the lead salamander biologist for the city for how many years now? 10 years. And we have Laurie and a few of her other colleagues to thank for how beautiful the pool is and for having the habitat restored to with all these native aquatic plants. And yes, absolutely. For those of you who've only been here recently, it didn't used to be that way. For years, decades, the pool was managed more like a municipal swimming pool, and they actually went to lengths to kill the plants. And keep the bottom essentially bare of, just with rock and dirt. And it would get stirred up and really messy. And now we have the plants that hold down the silt and displace the algae, and they're beautiful. So thank you, Laurie, for all that. And here she is, Biology of Barton Springs.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's a beautiful day. Obviously, it's going to be nice and hot like it is in Texas. Because it's nice and hot, I'm not going to get into any really deep science because it's Saturday, it's hot, and that's not as much fun. So we're not going to get into any Volterra equations or succession or any of that kind of stuff, right? Even though all of those sorts of things underpin everything we understand about how the biology and ecology of a system works, right? Anyway, so what I thought I would do is try to just emphasize three things. It's going to be E, F, and F. E is evolution in a broad sense, meaning change through time. F, water flow, and F, fostering. So, really short stuff about evolution and change through time. As you probably have gathered, if you heard Nico talking about the aquifer, these things develop over very, very long periods of time. Much longer than any one human generation, right? And the aquifer was forming long before there were any humans around here. So deep time, right? Then you kind of get to the part that's the biology. And that comes in a little later. It's not quite as deep a time, but it's still a really long time. I mean, it's still hundreds of thousands of years for these systems of organisms to develop and become intertwined. And that's still longer than 1 or 2 generations human time, right? It's still longer than what we remember about, any of these absolutely gorgeous pictographs of when the Native Americans were here or the natives were here, which you get to hear about if you stick around to listen to Gary Perez. Really cool. There's some human history. So we're talking about really long periods of time. Biologically, in a system like this, there are so many species, so many organisms in there, and they're all intertwined with each other, and they're all intertwined with how that environment has changed over time and how it changes dynamically from day to day. So it's always changing. There's nothing that doesn't change. If you had the right lens, every day you come here, there's going to be something different in that spring. You just have to have the right lens to see it, right? And that is the coolest thing I think about nature and about biology, and I think it's the most fun thing about it, is that there could be something different all the time. And you get to learn something new all the time. That's what makes this completely different than going to a municipal pool, right? Because if you go to a municipal pool, it's white, it's concrete, it's square, might be chlorinated. And it will be that way, and the lane lines will be there. They might get faded, then they might get repainted, right? But it's gonna be that way all the time. And that's fine. It's not what I like. I like showing up, and I like it to be different every day, and I like it to be a challenge, and I like it that I don't know everything about that spring, and I've been studying it for 10 years, right? Oh my God, 10 years, wow! Okay, 10 years is that in the time that that whole system took to develop and become intertwined. Now, huge driver in how that system is water flow. Makes sense, right? It is a spring, it is water. Down here, I grew up in Wisconsin. Up there we have a whole lot of lakes. We also have rivers, but we have a lot of lakes. You know, down here in Texas and in this whole Edwards Aquifer area, we have springs and we have creeks and we have rivers. We have almost no natural lakes in the state of Texas. We have reservoirs, in other words, places where we have put dams to bring the water deeper, to do a variety of things as humans, which you get to learn about if you stick around to listen to Clark Hancock talk about kind of more about the human history and use of springs for mills, all kinds of stuff like that, right? And water supply, so we use dams to do that. All right, so it's not apparent when you look at that water down there, it's not apparent exactly how much it's flowing. You don't really see that flow unless you're on the downstream side of the dam, right? You see all that water coming down, you kind of get, oh my God, there's water and it's really moving. All right, we're in a drought, and we've been in a drought. So the amount that that water is moving is not really even all that much relative to how much it can move. It's way below whatever its average is, right? Okay, so how do we characterize droughts? What do you hear if you watch, let's see, Jim Spencer, KXAN, and they say, here's our conditions. The lake levels are this, the lake levels are that. Barton Springs, what is 54 CFS? Yeah. You know what's really confusing about that? It's a flow rate, and it's something called discharge. So you'd think, well, if I got this number, it's discharge. Well, that should kind of define what's going on in the system. So you don't think about that you're not seeing the water moving, right? Thing is, discharge is a calculation. You're measuring how fast the water's moving. You measure the size sort of the tube that the water's going through, and you measure how fast it's going through. So this is it's basic mathematics, right? And it gives us a really good idea of kind of the volume of water moving somewhere. What that doesn't tell us is what all the biological fauna and flora actually experience. I might be wrong, but I don't think they do math. I don't think they have a way, to get to what we think as a really useful number, right? That's not what they detect. Everything that's in there, what they detect is water moving. How fast is it moving for wherever they are in that water column? That is something that is often called a flow regime, because, if you measure the speed of the water current in one location in Barton Springs, it'll be different than if you measure it at another location in Barton Springs. And all of those flow speeds and current speeds or velocities, all of those basically get glommed together in that one number called discharge. So for me and for studying the biology, the discharge is a nice general description of where we are with the aquifer, but it really doesn't tell me anything about what might be going on at the level of the flora and fauna that are really in that spring. So it's taking this, now we're going down to a slightly smaller scale. So if you could look in that spring for this place where the velocity might be 1/2 foot per second, what do you think you'll find down there? Do you guys know, what do you think you find right where the water is coming out of the caves? Actually, you find a lot. A lot of it's really small, so that's hard. And it's under rocks. I mean, surprising, right? There's a lot down there. And there's not a whole lot of sediment either, because the water's moving so fast. Now, if you go, let's say you're closer, halfway down the channel here, where it's fairly deep, right? If you were to measure the velocity about halfway up that water column, it might be 0.1 feet per second. You will probably find floating algae because it's kind of staying in place. It's not really going very far. You'll find the kinds of things that aren't really tightly attached or hiding under rocks. So the whole landscape of what lives where, even within this whole spring, is dependent upon how fast the water is moving and where they are in the water column. So it really defines how everything is interrelated. Now we change that by having the dams, and it changes when we open the gates, right? One of the really cool things about opening the gates in the downstream dam is that because the water depth goes down, the water can move faster. Discharge doesn't change, but the water can move faster. And now the water is taking care of that system sort of by itself. It keeps sediment from settling. It allows the kind of algae to grow that's very tightly attached. It flushes out the kinds of things that are just floating around. So there are good things about opening the gates in the downstream dam for the ecology of the system. However, this is all connected. There's not just that spring. There's the spring that's behind the concession stand. We call that Eliza Spring. There's a spring that's just down this way that we call Sunken Garden. Well, those springs are also affected when you open the gates in the downstream dam because it's all connected underground. So the water level goes down here, it goes down in Eliza Spring. Unfortunately, right now, when it goes down in Eliza Spring, it dries out that whole surface habitat. When it dries out that habitat, everything that's living there under the rocks gets stranded and potentially dies, right? So we're trying not to do that. So we kind of temper how much we open the gates, even though we know it's really good for water flow. So it's all kind of managing a system that's been, you know, it's been changed a little bit. All right, so what does this do for the things that live here? Well, we have more of some things and less of others, right? So the slower the water is moving at the substrate, we tend to have fewer things that live under rocks where there's no sediment. Okay, well that is things like little tiny invertebrates, little tiny scuds, things that limpets. They're not snails exactly, but they're related to snails. They like to be on the undersides of rocks and often on the top parts of rocks where there isn't sediment. You know, we have fewer salamanders, that kind of stuff. If you get into areas where you have a lot of less flow and lots of this kind of green, not very well attached algae, you get all kinds of tiny little creatures, insects basically, that are living and feeding on all of that algae, and that is algae. So there are types of algae that we like, there are types of algae that we don't like. There are types of algae that things eat, and there are types of algae that things don't eat. And flow, and how fast it's moving, is a really big determinant of what kind of algae you're gonna have, and then therefore, what kind of things are gonna live there, all right? So, I have two ways to go right now, which is, I can tell you about the food web first, or I can tell you about the interactions of algae and plants, and then how you get as many animals that are in here, and that brings us to the food web. So what do you want to hear about first?
Your turn.
It's my turn? No. Somebody's got to vote. Algae, okay. How many people who are here, were here in 2006, 2007, have seen through the kind of droughts and whatnot, right? Describe what it would look like when you got here. How clear was the water? Not. What was in the water? Or on it?
Algae. Lots of floating algae.
What did that algae look like?
Thick mats.
What color?
Green, brown, kind of crumbly.
Yep. What happens when you touch it? Becomes like nothing, right?
Right.
Suddenly, its particles too small to do anything with, and it's in the water column, and you can't see anything, right? So 2006, 2007 was generally the same amount of discharge where we are now. It was a drought condition. So I want to tell you that before I show you these pictures, okay? All right, algae. That is basically a blue-green algae, even though it's brown, but the brown part it's dying. But really unpleasant looking stuff, right? All right, how many fish were in here? A lot or a little? 0?
Yeah, not many.
Did you see turtles? Snakes? Eel? Birds? See any of that back then?
Grackles.
Plants? Grackles? We had grackles. Yes! Salamanders?
Not so much.
Yeah, really not very pleasant. And when you look at the substrate, what did it look like? It was brown. Wasn't really green. At least it wasn't the way I remembered it. Okay, I just wanted you to remember what that's like. What's it like now? Same conditions, same aquifer conditions. What's in there now? What's the water like?
Clear.
How far can you see in that water? See the bottom. What do we got in there? What else is in there?
I've been around 40 years.
Plants. What else?
Early in the day or late. Yeah, early in the day. I
Fish. Snails.
Yeah.
Eel. Snakes.
Seen 'em, yeah.
Turtles. Band-Aids. Yeah, us. Us. That's a really big difference, right? Now, why? It all goes back to algae, and it all goes back to sediment. All right, what do algae suck up that comes into this system? Nutrients. Bingo. Okay, what do plants suck up? Nutrients. Carbon dioxide, very good. Sunshine, very good. What they take the sunshine and the carbon dioxide, and what do? What do they make?
There's more oxygen in the water.
Sugars and oxygen. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. That means there's less nutrients and carbon dioxide for any of what I call the nuisance and rather distasteful, ugly algae to use. So the plants basically outcompete the algae that we had so much of back then, okay? What we do have is green algae, like the stuff in my snorkel mask doodah thing, that's kind of long. It will get attached and it will float. But you'll notice in that little clump of algae and in that thing how many insects are in there. And that's this much, all right? So if you got algae and you got plants, you now have oxygen for all of the invertebrates and all of the vertebrates to breathe from the water, and you now have food for everything that's in there. So we made that one change and changed the whole system without changing the flow regime. If we change the flow regime, that will be even more pronounced.
What was the change? What are you talking about?
We put plants in the system. We intentionally put in plants for that very purpose because everything's all interconnected in there. You pull this little thread over here and the whole freaking sweater falls apart. So all of those things are connected and they're really important and they're all interwoven with each other, all right? So I'm going to pass around, which was the plants algae part, which leads me to the food web part. Because I'm going to pass around this diagram that there will not be a test ever for you unless you choose to give it to yourself. There won't be a test. And you're not really supposed to fully get every little piece of this, right? I have a bigger one. It's not really big. But the idea is that everything's connected. Just about everything is connected. You got two really important things going on. Dissolved oxygen. If you don't have dissolved oxygen, there's a lot of things that aren't going to be alive in there. If you don't have plants, algae, carbon dioxide, and sunlight, there's a whole lot of things that aren't going to be alive in there. And you can't actually get the sunlight to the stuff that's the plants and the algae that we want to be in there if you have the nuisance algae, because it's making the water really murky. The roots of the plants are holding sediment in place. So when you're moving around and when the water's flowing through the system, it's not constantly stirring up sediment. So they're a really critical piece of what's making this place as resilient as it is right now, particularly to drought. And we are in a drought. And one of the things that happens in a drought is the water, when it's coming out of the aquifer, has less oxygen in it. So algae and plants are putting oxygen back into that system. And that's why we have as many fish. It's why we have the eel. It's why we have all of these different invertebrates, all of these different invisible and visible creatures in that system. So, little food web. I was getting really out of control for a while when I realized that. Then I was like, oh, well, wait, do the salamanders, they might eat damselflies and dragonfly larvae, but we're not really sure because we don't know that piece. And then I was like, oh, but wait, frass, that's like poop, fish, whatever, frass. And I'm thinking about that going, oh, I bet there's a bunch of stuff in there. Oh, wait, catfish actually, oh, well, I don't have an arrow. So I just stopped because you would never, this would just be like an ink blot. It would be, what do you see, right? But it's just everything is really connected in here. And so when you think about what happens in this site, one little piece might change over here and it's going to take time, right, for the system to shift. But it will shift. Now what will happen, actually let me phrase this differently. Gee, is there something we could do to make it go back to the way it was in 2006?
Keep putting in nutrients.
We could keep putting in nutrients. Yep. You could keep putting in nutrients. And where does that kind of stuff happen? Does that happen right here? Nah. That happens out in the watershed. So it's also part of why what happens out in that watershed and what goes into the aquifer really matters here. What else? Think about this for a second. Plant roots are in what? Sediment, right? All right, we know that floods bring in sediment because it comes up over the dams, all that stuff, right? But do you guys know sediment travels underground with the groundwater? Thing is, when it comes in here, it's coming in a little at a time, a little at a time, a little at a time. So you don't really know just until suddenly you get a whole lot of it. And then you start noticing what it is, right? So, plants hold down some of that sediment. It can't hold down all of it. Eventually, if you get a bunch of sediment, it will just bury things and we will be right back where we started. And we'll end up having to do the same thing over again, which I'm not really very excited about. All right, so I haven't said a word about salamanders, which is kind of awesome and entertaining for me, and I'm not going to yet. Because these are going to be up over there, SOS Alliance folks, and Stephen, I don't know where you are, put together these lovely, yes, these are gorgeous poster boards, and these are great. These are the plants we now have in Barton Springs, right? When I started, we had a few of these, and that was it. So we have all of this. They've got, and this isn't even, these aren't even pictures of all of the vertebrates that live here and around here in Barton Springs. It's beautiful. We have all of this stuff in here, and it's amazing the kind of diversity that we have in here, and all of it is all connected together. And it's connected together by those little tiny things that I was saying, the little tiny invertebrates, the little snails, the little amphipods, the little copepods that you can't even see, you know, the minuscule things that are all in there feeding all of this stuff. So, you know, when you're swimming around, you can take a look at these things, and if you hit it at just the right time, you can sit and swim through plants, and you can just see the oxygen just coming off in these great streams going up into the water. So, you know, it's your opportunity to go visit all kinds of really cool things, right? Really cool creatures. Now, the good part is that all in all in general, even though it's a drought, we do tend to have more salamanders than we've had in the past. So, actually, I'm just going to hand you guys these photos. And if you want to, hey, would you show some of those, just hand these out and let people get a good look at that? Let them see some pretty stuff. Let them see the,
Does it pass it out?
yeah, and let them see the boards. Oh, like be like Vanna White. I'd like to buy a vowel. I'd like to buy a consonant. I pick S. And my consonant is S for salamander. Thank you. Matt Holland, you already knew where I was going with that. Man, spoiler alert. The most salamanders we have actually are in Eliza Spring. One of the reasons it is that way is because Eliza Spring is it's shallow water these days. You know, it's more like a spring with a stream that comes out of it. And that's how everything really would be around here if we didn't have dams or amphitheaters or whatever. And that's kind of ideal for them to be in this shallower water. And you know, they're not getting disturbed by us and by people swimming in there, and so they basically do better in there. And so we have generally a couple of hundred salamanders in there at any one time, which is really good. I mean, it jumps up and down, but they're still endangered. And when they're not doing so well, we do have a clue that maybe there's something not so great in the entire environment for them. So they're, everybody always asks me, are they the canary in the coal mine? I'm like, you know? So, and I just kept thinking about it, and I was just like, well, not really, that just sounds, it just makes me think of Tweety Bird. So so I don't know, I decided today that what they are is the salamander in the spring. Because that does tell us, regardless of whether you like salamanders, I mean, you know, if it's your favorite thing, or if you think they're a pain, or because it dictates some things that we do, or because they're endangered, or whatever that is, or because people are excluded from 2 of the spring sites because we manage it just for salamanders. I mean, you may not like that. However, they are, in fact, the salamander in the spring. And when they are doing poorly, it is telling us something. And when they are doing better, it is telling us something. And the reason we know that shallow water, flow regime, you know, get rid of the blue-green algae, have plants, the reason we know that that's better for salamanders in the long run is because that's what we did in Eliza Spring. And those salamanders started reproducing and the whole population size went up. They told us what was better in that spring. And that really was part of why we made so many efforts to get plants and to change some stuff in Barton Springs. So they're the salamander in your spring. So, evolution, change through time. Don't change things too fast. These kinds of systems, every piece of this system cannot readjust. If we change things every year, every 10 years, every 50 years, I mean, you need, you know, 100 years. So if you're going to change something in the environment, slow down. Do it more slowly. Evolution happens slowly, and it happens over multiple generations. So think about the next generation, and think about the next generation, and think about your kids and your grandkids, and how much, I suspect, you would like this place to be beautiful for them. That's really important, right? Flow, water flow, it matters, because if it's not there at all, we don't have that. Pretty simple. And the very, very last piece was fostering, right? This one's really, really easy. Fostering. Fostering protection of the site means you and me and everybody go tell everybody what you learned. When you get in that spring and someone says, I don't know what this plant is, why do we have them? Tell them, hey, look at this, you know? Look at that fish. It wouldn't even be here. You know, get excited about it and be the thing that fosters that place. Because if we don't do it collectively, it's not going to happen. So that's it. Thank you for coming and listening. I really, really appreciate it. I want you to get in there and tell me everything you see. Yeah.
Can you talk about, I've heard that the plants are sometimes cut.
They are.
How do they cut them? How deeply do they cut them? And how does that affect them?
So the plants are managed kind of, I mean, in a way, if you had a garden, you would manage a garden. Thank you. And you would, you know, try to get rid of things that are weedy. Here, the plants are managed outside of salamander habitat to balance the needs of safety, the need for safety for, you know, people using the site, and then what is good for the ecological system. So the idea is to do parts gradually. Because they're tall, typically we'll go down and we'll cut and then go back and pull up a root ball if we need to actually weed, you know, get some of them out just to thin them out. If it's just trimming them, you know, goal is maybe 4 feet above the substrate, just so when people are swimming, they're not, you know, running into it. It is hard to keep up with the plants. The other thing is that in managing plants in the state of Texas with something here, this applies to the rivers, the reservoirs, everything else. You send the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, they review your plant management plan for non-natives and then anything that's a nuisance. They review it and will give you a permit for it. So part of it too is that they have a say in what we do, when we do it, kind of, you know, how we do it. So right now the goal has been smaller areas, cut down to maybe 4 feet, and then move to another area. The other,
You mean 4 feet below the level of the water?
like 4 feet from the substrate roughly. There's also in the deepest channel, there are places where we'll trim more so that the water can actually flow. So there's at least a channel where the water that's coming out of the spring can flow without just going straight up. And so there are parts where, you know, we try to go in and do a real channel, but
Are these all native plants?
yes. Yep.
And are some of these natives also invasive? I'm assuming that they are
Sure.
invasive.
Yeah, yeah. The stargrass where you get the big kind of thick columns that when they come out of the water, they have the little tiny yellow star-shaped flowers. The stargrass is like a crop. I mean, it's invasive in that sense. It's native, but I mean, it's invasive. It will definitely spread quite a bit. And that's the one that we end up spending more time trying to just remove some plants and let the other ones sort of fill in.
And how do you cut things underwater?
Scuba gear and the same tools. Like, you know, I use sort of a little, yeah.
Hedge trimmer?
Yeah, hedge trimmer. I myself am a fan of, it's sort of like, I think it's actually it's a little saw, but I kind of do it like a machete. And so part of that is going through and, you know, cutting and then pulling things out. We, you know, there's all kinds of things living in plants and on plants. And so you want to be able to see as much as you can what you're doing, because not only would it be really bad press if we cut a bass in half, it would be really insensitive, you know. I mean, you know, you don't want to do that. And the closer you get up to where salamander habitat is, I mean, not only us salamander biologists deal with plants up there because we do need to look for salamanders first, and we, you know, try to get as much wildlife that's in the plants in the water. And so a lot of the strategy is you cut the plant and you let it, you know, float and kind of push it over to the side so the stuff has a chance to get out of it and then pull it out. Does that help?
Like every month or every month?
Oh, they're doing it every week, 1 or 2 days a week.
Oh, it's intensive, yeah.
It's intensive, and because, you know, the water's so clear right now, and because the water's not flowing very quickly. So when the water is flowing more strongly, it inhibits the plant growth. Well, it's not doing that right now. So these plants are going crazy. I mean, this is heaven for plants right now, but what were you gonna ask?
When y'all designed the project to add plants back into the springs, was that more to mirror research on what it would have looked like prior to human disturbance, or is it just based on y'all seeing what would compensate for us being in there?
What would compensate for us being in there? Because we're keeping dams, you know, and since that, I mean, that makes it more lake-like, and so we basically had to go in and think about how to make it not quite a lake, but not quite a river.
Did that affect which species y'all chose to put in, or did you just kind of go for what would naturally be there and add more?
We chose what would naturally be there because we didn't know what would establish itself. I mean, we knew that the Sagittary that had been here, which has kind of the stiff leaves, and right now there's white flowers underneath it. It doesn't get very tall. Well, this centerpiece gets tall, but anyway, that was here. We knew that would be okay. That plant tends to capture a lot of sediment when it floods, and so you start getting the ever-increasing pile. And that's a really good one that does well along banks where the water is shallow because it really wants to emerge. So we didn't want to put more of that in there because we really don't want this to completely fill. So we tried various things, species, and then once basically a couple of the species took off, then with the subsequent floods, we had 5 species that colonized on their own, native species that colonized on their own. So that was kind of amazing. I was very surprised and really thrilled that that's what happened.
And you might have said this earlier, but you're talking about the sediment flow and build up in the plants. What do y'all do to deal with that, or do you just lower the dams and hope that it?
Well, so the hard part is that that stuff tends to settle when we're in conditions of drought, and the aquifer is not at a level where we can safely do a drawdown and it's safe for salamanders and safe for Eliza Spring. We just don't have water. So we don't do that, and we've committed to the Fish and Wildlife Service we're not going to do that because we're likely to kill a bunch of salamanders, and that's sort of bad. So, you know, I'll go in, a lot of times I'll go in and trim, and then if you've trimmed down some, when the regular cleaning where they use a fire hose, and basically anytime we're using fire hoses and hoses, you're just acting like a river, right? You're just making more flow. So they'll dislodge stuff by blowing the water through the plants to dislodge it on cleaning days, and then it can flow out.
How much do cleaning? Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
How
Well-
much do cleaning days affect like the environment? Because I worked here, and I always kind of wondered when we're going out there like attacking the pool with fire hoses. Like, how much is that really?
That's not really, I mean,
They seem
the only thing that happens with that currently that's about to end is that it's regular city drinking water, and so it has chlorine and chloramine in it, which is toxic to aquatic life, but it's so diluted, right? However, once we get through this grounds improvements project, part of that is installing a pump system so that all that will be spring water. So that part is not, I mean, that's not that big a deal. I mean, you don't do that in salamander habitat, but you know, it's effective in that sense. I did this a long time ago. This was I should leave this around. This was what happens when you have dams and you never open them. There's this part where it's the nuisance algae and all this, and you guys can look at it, and this is kind of like if you get more flow, what happens? Well, my part down here was the part where it's infinite cleaning. Because at some point with algae, you scrub it, right? Well, it will algae grow as fast as you can clean it. And so it's kind of understanding that you'll never do something where you go in and scrub the slippery algae off and that it won't grow back. I mean, unless you're going to put chlorine or copper sulfate on it, we're not going to do that. So there's part of it where it's infinite cleaning. It's why what you want to do is inhibit the algae from growing to begin with.
Even the chlorine and the copper sulfate doesn't always keep it from coming back.
It comes back eventually, doesn't it?
Yes,
No matter what?
no matter what.
See, algae, source of life on the planet, we cannot win. We cannot win. Let me get someone in back. Just.
Having a large deposit of silt over time would be a problem. Would having, say, a large amount of water, say from 100 years without flood in the river, would that cause the amount of silt where you have to pretty much restart? And if not, would say a large deposit of water all at once.
From Barton Creek? You mean coming down this way?
Massive storm,
Flowing over the dam. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
20 plus inches.
Well, it will flush some things out, like the finer grained things are gonna, a lot of it's gonna go out because it's entrained in the water. But then what it will do is bring in a bunch of rocks, and that will settle because we have a dam, right? So the water having to go over the dams and kind of hitting the downstream dam is gonna make more things settle in front of the dam. So one of the, yes, it would help even better if we get to modifying this downstream dam such that we either have more openings or bigger openings or something so that when you get a flood, that dam becomes more invisible to the flood. Because floods do exactly what you're talking about in that they push material through systems, right? Downstream, eventually, it gets to the ocean and goes back into the center of the earth. So some will deposit, yeah, because we have dams. Some will also go out.
Will that negatively impact the long-term development of the spring in any way?
If we don't do anything about it, yeah. But it's why dredging projects become necessary. And we did one where it hadn't been done in, I don't know, 15 years and took out a whole lot of gravel and sediment that had collected. But the part of the regular maintenance for Barton Springs going forward is to try to do things like vacuum dredging every few years so that the stuff that comes in and gets deposited can just be vacuumed out so it doesn't accumulate so much, basically. Your answer is yes and no. Isn't that awesome? Yeah.
Did the bypass rebuild, was it a success for the pool? And second, the new type of dam on the lower dam, is that preventing less flooding, in your opinion?
So for the bypass culvert.
Yes,
Yeah.
why the pool was closed.
Yeah, so it was a success because we no longer have a bunch of water from the pool going under it and into the inside of it anywhere, it was all over. So yes, that is not happening anymore, and that's a really good thing. So it was definitely a success in that sense. And then in the upstream part, there's a new grate on the inlet. Yeah, so that basically what it means is with the bypass repair, the size inside is a little smaller than it was. That's balanced by that new grate that allows more water to pass into it more easily and doesn't clog. So basically it won't change. I mean, the flooding will be what it is. It won't change relative to that aspect of the system. I mean, it could change just because we have a lot of development and we get shorter storms and, it's not going to change based on that.
Right after that, we're causing not flooding the streams when before that they were.
Correct. The first thing that we got, the first time that it rained, which I think there's only been a couple times, but yeah, it came very, very close and it transmitted the material instead of it popping up and over those little bitty ones. And then the lifeguards didn't have to go stand, first of all, they didn't have to go stand on a grate in the middle of a flood with their rakes pulling all the sticks off. I mean, come on. They have to stand there in the middle. It's not safe. I believe I'm saying it, but yeah, it's not very safe.
Two more questions.
What were you gonna ask me? Sorry.
Well, I wondered up, so I hope I'm not asking something that's already been answered.
Well, I'll just answer you later privately. No, I'm teasing.
I just wanted to ask about, once upon a time, I guess there was weekly drawdown cleanings. And I was just wondering, how often are the total drawdown cleaning allowed and practiced? And what are the results between weekly, daily, quarterly, whatever? What's the difference?
The difference in when it was clean, when the drawdowns were done weekly, one of the there were a lot of salamanders that got stranded and died, and Eliza Spring went dry, so a lot of salamanders got stranded and died there, and they were done under any aquifer condition. So, it didn't matter if you were in a drought. All right. One of the things that happened is the gates were not adjustable in the downstream dam. They were just plates. So the water basically receded so quickly that wildlife and salamanders couldn't follow it into the aquifer. All right, so 98 we get our permit from Fish and Wildlife Service, and drawdowns were limited to 4 full drawdowns a year, and it had to be when the discharge from the complex was above a certain threshold, and that was to keep Eliza Spring from going dry. And then the other part was putting in adjustable gates. So the really great thing is that adjustable gates have allowed us, since we're controlling the rate that the water goes down, we basically don't strand salamanders anymore. So that is a huge improvement, and it makes drawdowns a lot more manageable. And then our new permit for the next 20 years to be issued in the next month. And in there, given that the aquifer is at that threshold condition, because we still don't want Eliza Spring to go dry, we can do 4 full drawdowns a year and then 8 partial drawdowns. And the partials really help for cleaning up and the upstream end. So we're going from what was 4, which really wasn't enough in the system, up to possibly doing 12. And I think that will be, it will be really helpful. And we did that as an experiment, I forgot when, 2004 or 2005, but anyway, habitat was better. Things were better when we could do those partial drawdowns. So they are a good thing if controlled well, and if they occur when we're not in a drought, essentially.
One more question.
Who have I got? Yeah.
I think in your poster is very interesting. Can you just go very quick?
Which one?
The ball?
This one?
And this one? Can you?
Oh, the history. Okay, I didn't really say much about the history of the sites, and this is going to be really short because Clark Hancock is going to talk about this. So I didn't, right? But just a little taste, just to give you some perspective. Oh, thank you. It's at 2 o'clock. So I don't know if you've ever been over to Sunken Garden, which is the one over there. That's an amphitheater, right? Well, there used to be a mill on it, and here's a picture of that mill that was there. So it was used as a mill.
A grist mill?
Yeah, I think so. Clark can answer that. And then essentially there were a couple walls from that, and then the Sunken Garden Amphitheater was built essentially on top of it. So this is superimposing the mill, and this is the amphitheater structure there. So these are some old photos of that. These are the gates from that, of what that site was, and then this is just kind of a shot from the 70s of what's the amphitheater part now, and the mill would have been like right here. So we've changed the sites a lot over time. And the one what's Eliza Spring, I don't know if Clark has this photo, he probably does. But we do have a photo of that before any amphitheater or anything was built on it. So it's pretty interesting. You guys good?
Thank you so much.
You guys come talk to me. I'll answer your questions.